Well, good evening, everybody. I guess it was time to do a class. I was told about 8 months ago that it was time for us all to go up another level. When I say we, I'm talking about this larger community that's built up around here. We've been doing script and kid work and relationship work for 7 or 8 years now, and many of us have been meditating, had meditative practices that long, and we've listened to lots and lots of Joel and Barbara Mull and lots of Robert Adams, and the result of all this work is that our individual lives are considerably more comfortable, but also there's a consciousness in Hermosa Beach that now can be used as a foundation to take another significant step upward, and I think that's what's starting out now. And that's the reason that this is a closed class. This is the first closed class we've ever had here. We've always been much more informal and casual and doing things workshop style and coming and going as we pleased. Now, the idea of a closed class is to develop the consciousness in the class as we go along. For that reason, we meditate for 15 minutes at the start. That already has deepened our consciousness together. And because we've all meditated for the 15 minutes, we'll be able to go deeper and further this evening. And that will be the platform that we start with next Monday night. And the information that may or may not get passed out here tonight will be useful then, as will the consciousness that we develop tonight. And hopefully what happens is that week after week the consciousness gets deeper and we get more and more, we get lifted higher and higher as this process goes on. So for that reason, it's a closed class, and closed class means that nobody can join the class after the first session, and because we don't want people who are not with us in consciousness coming in and dragging the group down. And it's also not okay to miss classes, because the same thing would happen if you're not here and you miss a class and you come in the week later, then you won't be with us. So we're going to push forward and grow as far as we can during these 8 weeks. As far as I know, it could go possibly another week after that, informally. Once upon a time, so you'll know it's a story, in a city in Japan, an intellectual who was well renowned in Japan and had mastered lots of philosophies and lots of religions and lots of techniques and had all sorts of letters after his name, went to a Zen master to see if he could get instruction. The Zen master invited him in, and they sat down, and while the intellectual described all the initials after his name, the Zen master made tea. And then the intellectual started describing all the philosophies that he'd mastered, and the Zen master poured the tea. And then the intellectual explained all the religions that he'd studied and the depths to which he'd gone in them, while the Zen master drank his tea. And then the intellectual went on to explain how difficult it had been for him to do some of this work, and the Zen master took the tea and refilled his cup and poured more tea into the already full cup of the intellectual. And the tea, of course, went all over the place and all over the intellectual, and the intellectual screamed at him, "What are you doing?" And the Zen master said, "I'm demonstrating to you that before we can put new tea into the cup, we have to empty the cup." And he sent the intellectual on his way. And that's where we start. That's what we're going to do tonight. Is we certainly are not going to empty the cup successfully, but we are going to identify at least how full the cup is and what needs to go, because the class is called An Introduction to Spiritual Consciousness, and spiritual consciousness is absolutely unlike human consciousness. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to get rid of before we can gain this new understanding. The first thing we need to get rid of is our habit of using our intellects. Spiritual understanding is not gained through use of the intellect. It's not something that can be figured out. It's referred to often as ineffable. It's not explainable. It is by its very nature impossible to describe. So we will have to not use our intellects to try to figure what this is all about. For that reason, we're not going to do questions and answers during this particular series of classes like we've done in all the workshops and the Tuesday night talks, because questions engage the intellect. And as Rashneesh told me, if you ask a question and I answer it, your head immediately generates 9 more. So the process never ends. And the other thing is that if you ask a question and it gets answered, everybody's mind will generate 9 more. So that we'll now have however many times 9 there are questions here. So we're not going to do questions and answers at the class. If on next Monday you still have questions about this class, you can write them down and bring them to class and put them here on the hassock here, and we'll look at them before the class and decide whether or not we want to answer them now, or perhaps we'll answer questions like that in a 9th informal session or something like that. So if you have a question you want to ask, write it down and we'll look at it, and if it means that if it's a simple fact that the explanation wasn't clear, then perhaps we can clear it up before we go further. I suggest also that we don't take notes during the class, because that involves the intellect. You have to figure out what's worth writing down and what isn't worth writing down. And so we are recording these classes, and I will put the audio for the class up on the internet tomorrow, the next day, and you will all get an email telling you where it is, and you can go listen to it there, study it during the week as many times as you want to, and take all the notes you want to there. And that way you don't need to take notes tonight. The idea is to be passive in this process, to be as meditative and as open and as embracing as you can be while being passive. We need to hear what's being said, which is a passive thing, hearing, but we don't want to listen, which is the active form of the verb, because if we're listening for something or listening to something, and we don't want to be doing that. We want the head out of it. We want it just to soak in and hear what we hear. And you don't need to agree with anything that's said. It doesn't need to agree with anything you believe, and if it's different, it doesn't make either one of us right or wrong. Believing has nothing to do. Just hear what's said and let it in, and perhaps go back during the week and listen to it again once or twice and see if any of it's true for you. All right, the first thing that we're going to have to really give up is, may as well start at the bottom, all of our concepts about God. All of our concepts about God have to go. And if we look at it, look at the history of mankind and the concepts of God that man has had, from thunder and lightning to the Egyptians thinking that the sun was God, and then thinking that cats were God at one time, and then pharaohs became gods. The Romans had 15 or 20 different gods, including suns and moons and messengers, and the Greeks had another set that were essentially the same but with different names. In India they have 1,000 different concepts of God, and different people worship different facets of God. And in England they thought God was nature and worshipped trees. The Druids did. there have been endless concepts of God. The Hebrews had many gods, and then then Abraham got the understanding that there was only one God, and probably from the Egyptians, and so they had one God in the Hebrew tribe, except that God was really just an amalgamation of all the gods, and it was one God that did everything instead of individual gods taking care of individual functions. Gradually, human consciousness has gotten more sophisticated, and so our concepts of God have gotten more sophisticated. And we've gotten away from punishing gods and really heinous gods to gods that are easier to get along with. They don't actually butcher people that much anymore, or things like that, but we've moved up to gods that are one step above Santa Clauses, but are available to perhaps fulfill our needs if we do things right. And our concepts of God keep growing and getting more sophisticated, but there's absolutely no reason to think that the concept we have today is the right and final concept. I mean, the concept of God has been changing for 10,000, probably 50,000 years, and there's no reason to think that any concept we have today is the ultimate concept. So we might want to think about what concepts we have of God, and consider how sure we are that what we think God is the right concept of it. One of the nice things about AA and the other 12-step programs is they encourage you to come up with a different concept than the one you were brought up with, which might have been a punishing God or one that you couldn't live with. So in AA, they're well aware that we all have concepts of God, but the point is that for the step we're taking, having a false concept of God is one of the things that needs to be emptied out, because having a false concept of God will prevent us from getting a true understanding. And there's one other comment I could make about concepts, is that a concept is by its very nature limiting. So you can't have a concept of God and an infinite God. Concepts by their very nature draw boundaries around something, so you can't possibly have any concept of an infinite God. And yet our more sophisticated spiritual understandings understand an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God. So look at your concepts over the next week and see what your concepts are. While we're looking at God, let's talk about prayer. Your concept of prayer, our current form of prayer. Prayer has had the same history that God has had in the human development. Mankind originally was probably just scared to death of God, because God was just these powers that happened at random. But as mankind became more self-aware and more aware of our ability to manipulate ourselves and others, it became obviously in our interest to manipulate God, or to persuade God, or to cajole God. And we developed an unending list of ways of trying to persuade God to do what we wanted, including dancing, including sacrificing virgins, or slaughtering tribes, or torturing people, or burning incense, or shaking holy water, or dancing or not dancing, or the list is endless. And we've gone from asking for asking God to kill our enemies to more sophisticated things than that. But if we look back at our history, no technique of prayer has been particularly successful. We cannot look at the Egyptians and see that the belief that worshiping the cat was more successful than the sun, or dancing to the cat, or dancing to the sun and not dancing to the cat, and the Druids worshipped trees, but the Romans nonetheless took over the Druids. The Hebrews had their one god and wound up, as soon as Abraham was gone, in slavery to the Egyptians. And they were a very religious tribe and undoubtedly prayed for centuries and remained slaves of the Egyptians until one man, Moses, became sufficiently illumined to bring them out of slavery himself, at which point they had the Ten Commandments in the ark and lost the ark and were defeated, and found the ark and were not defeated, and eventually, of course, Moses was gone and they were in the Promised Land, but shortly thereafter they were taken over by the Romans once again. And this is a highly religious, fairly sophisticated religious group, but prayer wasn't particularly effective. And the Romans had 100 ways of praying, none of which were particularly effective, and the Hindus with their 1,000 gods leave burnt offerings in front of them, or food, or burn incense, or light lights, or leave fruits, and starve to death or not, apparently at random. We can go on and on, but there's no history of prayer working. During the Second World War, a great example, we had German Lutheran mothers in Germany praying that their sons survive and the American sons be defeated in this war, and we had German Lutheran mothers in the United States in the same church praying that their sons be spared and that the sons of the other ones, i.e. the other German Lutheran mothers' sons, be killed. And some of both sides did, and some of both sides didn't. Once again, the Jews were incarcerated and praying, and surely there were lots and lots of Jews all over the world that were praying for the relief of the Jews, and that didn't happen. As Joel likes to say, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world were praying for peace. And Joel says, we got peace just about the time they ran out of ammunition, So it's not at all obvious that these forms of prayer that we've been using, the forms of prayer that are designed to convince God to do something for us, are effective. I can't find any time in history where we can see anything that happened over a significant period of time that was clearly the result of an effective style of prayer. Nowadays, many of us are very sophisticated so that we really give God a lot of slack. We pray to God to give us something, and if He gives us something, it means He loves us. And if He doesn't give it to us, it means it wasn't good for us and He loves us. And sometimes He gives it to us and it turns out not to be good for us. And that meant that God was, in His infinite wisdom, allowing us to learn a lesson. We have an amazing ability nowadays to cut God slack so that no longer is God responsible for His actions, and therefore we don't have a bad history of the success of prayer anymore, because it always works. I tried that with my cat several years ago, and it worked with the cat too, by the way. So over the next 2 weeks, look at what you pray for and how you pray for, and just look at it and see what techniques you're using to get whatever you're praying for and what it is you think you're praying to, because none of this has been effective in human history, and this may be on the list of things that need to go. What else on that? See, this really is emptying out. It's not like the first step. You guys are in for deep trouble. The first step says that we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. And what do I do now? Where do I go? What do I do? Well, this is the first step. We're emptying out. That's the first step of AA, is an emptying out, giving up of the fact that I can control and manage this. A very necessary step is emptying out. We can also take a look at organized religion, and I'm sure that many of you are in an organized religion, which is quite possibly very positive for you. But in general, organized religion needs to be understood. One of the problems of organized religion is that they need to support themselves. They need to attract a large enough audience that they can get enough money to support the church and to support the priest class, or preacher class, as the case may be. And this affects the teaching. Another difficulty with most Orthodox religions is that they're dogmatic, and they have a dogma that they want you to believe, and they teach you that dogma rather than even admitting that you can have your own direct personal experience of God, let alone teaching you how to have your own direct personal experience of God. Because, of course, if you can have your own direct personal experience of God, you don't need a priest in the church. I'm continually amazed to look at your fundamental Orthodox Christian churches and compare them with the words of Jesus. And I find practically no similarity. They've gone so far astray from what Jesus taught, which was that you didn't need to go to church, and that there were no Sabbaths, and that you didn't need priests, and that you can have your own experience, and that there's no need to sacrifice, and there's no need, and on and on and on. And he also taught throughout the Ten Commandments, all but one, and got rid of the idea that you had to be good and perfect and all this sort of thing. So Orthodox religions tend to be very restricting and very closing. It's interesting, Buddha was an enlightened master and had an amazing ministry for 50 years. And as he got older and older, the disciples, more and more, the ones who hadn't received any illumination yet, thought they understood him. And one day Buddha died, and the next day there were 16 sects of Buddhism, none of which had his message, because the message gets passed from enlightenment to enlightenment. What they all had was their understanding, what they thought he was saying, and that started the 16 sects of Buddhism, which are now down to 4 or 5 major sects of Buddhism that with 2 billion people belonging to them, and they don't have the message of Buddha in them. The same happens if you look at the Taoist religions and you look at what Lao Tzu wrote. The same happens if you look at the Christian religions and the dogma there and what Jesus wrote or said. Organizing any religion immediately limits it and limits the illumination of it and reveals the message and eliminates the purpose of having a direct experience. The point, by the way, of spiritual consciousness, the point of any work that we do here, is for each person to have your own intimate personal experience of the presence of God in your life, thus eliminating the need for anybody or anything, any priests or prayer people or people to teach you, since you will now have available to you your own teaching. The purpose of this work is to have your own experience, which puts you in touch with everything. And that's the earmark of a true teaching. And yet, although we can look somewhat skeptically at the record of God so far, or the concepts of God, and somewhat skeptically at the record of prayer so far, and somewhat skeptically at the record of organized religion so far. The thing that we keep in mind is that there have been these people, many, many, many people, these enlightened people, these people like Lao Tzu and like Buddha and like Jesus and like Shankara and many, many gurus and saints in India and many, many saints in the Christian church who have performed miracles and who have healed and who have done amazing things. There is something. The and yet there is something, There's lots of mystic poetry, which I happen to really love, lots of English mystic poetry, but especially the Muslim English poetry from Rumi or from Kabir or people like that, ecstatic poetry from these people who are writing and ecstatically in a state of bliss while in the actual experience of the presence of God, And now that's the kind of thing that I think is worth shooting for, and that's the kind of experience that all these teachers are saying that everybody can have individually. And that's the spiritual experience. Spiritual consciousness and mystical consciousness are synonymous. And this ecstatic poetry is what's written by mystics, people who are having the mystical experience, the ones who happen to be poetic. A very high experience. So there is something, and the other thing we've seen is, we know about Jesus' healing ministry, although it's pretty easy after 2,000 years to doubt that. Similarly, by the way, Buddha had a much larger and much longer healing ministry than Jesus did, because he was around for 50 years and wound up with ashrams doing healing work all over India. Joel Goldsmith, who's one of my teachers through his books, had the most amazing healing ministry of anyone, and this is authenticatable. You can check on this. Joel healed, had just an amazing ability to heal. He was healing during the height of his career in the late 40s and early 50s, 100, 130 people a day, of all sorts of things, from cancer to flu to breech babies to broken bones to car accidents. He actually healed some mongoloid babies. He actually put arms back on babies that were born without arms. I mean, healing ministry of the most amazing caliber. And based entirely on Jesus' teaching, just bringing through that truth, the basic Christian teaching, which is also the basic Buddhist teaching, heal the sick, raise the dead, teach the truth. So he demonstrated it. And it also was demonstrated quite extensively by the Christian Science Church back at the end of the 1800s, when Mary Baker Eddy brought through the revelation prior one to Joel's and started Christian Science. And I mean, this is a woman in 1870, and therefore uneducated and having no power, and a total lack of respect that women in 1870 had, who got the healing consciousness and began healing and began demonstrating it. And the end result was 3,000 Christian Science churches around the world with 15,000 Christian Science practitioners doing spiritual healings. So obviously there was something there, that doesn't happen unless there's demonstration. And then the students got too far away from the teacher, and the direct light was lost, and the movement still exists, but it's much less significant now, and it's much less known because the number of practitioners and the height of the practitioners and the height of the teaching is not what it used to be. And there are some very high Christian Science and very high religious science churches, especially right now, that are doing demonstrable healing work. But that's all a part of the mystical consciousness, and it's what we're going to be talking about over the next 8 weeks. So there is something, it's just not where human consciousness thinks it is. Another concept that we really need to look at, and yet this is the one that will tend to clear the room, is matter. Good old matter, nuts and bolts and atoms and stuff like that. And the question that we could look at over the next week is why we believe there is such a thing as matter. And this question is going to be coming up during this class, as silly a question as it appears to be. And I will say a couple of things on that tonight, just to start the thinking process, to start the observation process. The first is that if you take the most materialistic science we have, physics will demonstrate for you that there is no matter. Physics will take the matter down to cells, and the cells down to molecules, which are very, very far apart, and the molecules down to atoms, which are very, very far apart, and the atoms down to nucleuses and electrons, which are very, very far apart, and the nucleus down to subparticles in the nucleus, protons and neutrons, which are very, very far apart. You get the point now that the amount of vacuum there is in everything is 99.99999%. But no, the stuff that's left still isn't matter. The electrons that are flying around, they're not sure whether they're particles or waves. They don't behave like particles all the time. They don't behave like waves all the time. They're not sure what they are, but they're really sure they're not solid matter. They're actually a cloud of probability as to where they are. And if you get down to the subatomic particles, I mean, they just keep going smaller and smaller and smaller, and they actually now have virtual particles which disappear before they appear in time. Okay? They disappear. I said that correctly. They disappear before they appear in time, these little virtual particles. Okay? And this is the stuff that absolute hardcore modern physics is talking about. There's 2 papers in the Dancing Woolly Masters, which is a book looking at New Age physics. There's 2 papers there, one by a New Age physicist in the 60s or so, and one by one of the rishis in 5000 BC, and his translated into modern English. And the question was, which was written by which? And there was no way to tell. You know, they were both saying exactly the same thing, you know. So there's no... It's very clear if you look at physics that there is no such thing as solid matter. That's a concept we have. Now the next thing that physics will tell you is that there's no sound out there. What we call sound is just waves in air, and the waves in air hit your ear, and your ear vibrates. There's no sound there yet. I mean, it's not like your ear flapping that causes it. The ear vibrates. And ear vibrating gets converted into electrical impulses on auditory nerves, and now we got little neurons firing, you know, and there's no sound there. I mean, we sure haven't heard a high C yet, you know. There's just neurons firing, and the neurons fire up into the brain, and somehow they get stirred up in the brain, and high C comes out, or low D, or something like that. You know, the sound is in your brain. It's not in the object out there that caused the vibration, caused the air to vibrate, and it's not in the vibrations. The sound was introduced in your head after it got reduced to electrons firing in nerves. And color is the same way. Color comes in, but color is just frequency of light, and it strikes your eye, and it goes into a chemical pot at the back of your eyeball, and that chemical pot in your retina converts the stuff somehow into, again, nerve impulses that go on a different kind of nerve, and this kind of nerve goes up there, but we've still got nerves firing, and they're firing little energy charges, and it gets up to your brain, and it goes around in your brain, and it comes out red instead of high C. I don't know why, but maybe the pipe it came in on, but once again, the color was added by your brain. And so for touch, and so for smell, and so for taste. All of these are neurons firing in your brain and you ascribing these things to them. It's just very interesting to me how my brain can come up with orange, having never seen orange, having never seen anything except neurons firing. How does it come up with orange, or green, or sea, or hard, or rough, or sour? You know, it's making this stuff up. So once again, there's no reason to believe that there's, in fact, I can think of no, you guys can try this during it, I can conceive of no experiment that would prove to me that there is anything out there. I think it's inconceivable that there's any experiment that you could exercise that would prove that there is anything out there. So that's the second question. Now, just as another thing, in case you're thinking, well, your mind can't really do all of that, it can't really come up with all of that stuff, make all that stuff up, then I ask if any of you had a dream last night. Every time we have a dream, suddenly a universe appears. A bubble inside our brain somewhere, I presume, except usually it's bigger than I think my brain is, but the universe appears. And it doesn't start with Adam and Eve. I mean, it starts right here, right now. And it's full of everything. It may be full of stars, or it may be just inside a room. And I might be sitting at a coffee table in a room, and I knock on the table, and it's hard. You know, it's hard, it's matter, it's solid matter. And I'm in this dream, and I'm seeing matter and experiencing these five senses, and all this stuff is here, and it's absolutely convinced it's real. And if you're having that dream, and I come walking in and sit down at the coffee table with you and say, you know, this is a dream, you're going to say nonsense. You're going to pound on the table, and you know it's real. And it is no realer to that you in the dream than this is to this you in this dream, perhaps. There's no reason to think that this isn't just a dream, that I haven't been able to find that experiment either. So that would be the next thing to consider emptying out, whether or not there really is matter. Whether or not anything exists. Human consciousness, of course, is absolutely convinced that all of these things that I'm questioning, I mean, you know, human consciousness has already conditioned us thoroughly with the answers to all of these questions, you know, that there is a God and that it's worth praying to, and that sometimes it'll happen to us and other times we're just not good enough, and that, you know, churches are mostly good and sometimes bad when they're political, and that there really is matter, and, you know, I mean, human consciousness is absolutely convinced that everything I'm saying is pure nonsense, and we're conditioned from birth to believe what human consciousness believes. But there's no possible reason to believe that I can see why that there isn't any such thing as matter. So, and that will lead us into the whole arena of the three stages of consciousness, which are material and mental and spiritual. That might give you a hint as to what it could mean that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, a material experience. Oh, how are we doing? I don't want to let this go more than an hour. There's so much stuff still. We were talking about, I was just talking about conditioning. This work is very hard work. We thought script work and kid work was hard work. and it was hard work, but it was just hard work there in that we were dealing with getting in touch with something that we'd been repressing or hiding or unwilling to admit. And when we were in touch with it, it was just a matter of dealing with some emotions and things like that that we'd suppressed. And I don't mean to make lightly of it, but that was hard work at a personal, experiential level, and it's very hard work, and a lot of us are still in it. And but this work is in the face of 6.3 billion people who are radiating at you subliminally into your human consciousness the fact that everything I've said tonight is bullshit. And there really is a Buddha, and he will show up tomorrow and save you, or whatever myth they're trying to tell us. The extent of the conditioning is, we have no idea the extent to which we're conditioned. The only ones that know the extent to which we're conditioned are earning large salaries in Madison Avenue, where they are conditioning us. They have learned the high dollar that's available for conditioning us. Now, there are 3 conditionings that Joel points out that we need to go if we're going to attain the end goal of this, which is the full-on spiritual consciousness. And the first, these are major areas of conditioning. The first one is the belief in 2 powers. Humans, let's start the other end. If there is a God, an infinite God, that is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent everywhere, and omnipotent, all-power, if there is such a being, if that God is the real God, then there is no power left over for anything else. And yet, deeply ingrained in human consciousness is the belief that many, 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 many things have power. Germs have power, earthquakes have power, tidal waves have power, fire has power, bombs have power, bullets have power, the law has power, our mothers have power, rulers have power. In human consciousness, there is just an amazing belief in human consciousness in a society that claims to believe in a one power, which is omnipotent. There's an amazingly deep belief in many other things that have power. And we wind up with God doing battle against the devil, or God doing battle against disease, or God doing battle against all these other powers. And God is not doing a very good job of battling all these powers. They continue to go on. You'll notice that if somebody's sick, we may pray for the person, but we don't take them out of the hospital while we pray for them, because we think medicine has power to help them, and we're just using God as a backup in case the medicine doesn't work. Or perhaps we're using medicine as a backup in case God doesn't work. I don't know, but there's a deep-seated belief in more than one power. And not only more than one power, but in good and bad, or good and evil, and in all the dualisms. One of the identifying features of human consciousness is the dualistic thinking. For every tall there's a short, for every good there's a bad, for right there's a wrong, for fat there's a thin, for everything there's the opposite. That's just the way human people think. And that all those terms are, once again, in our minds, because person is tall, standing next to a short person, but then they walk next to a taller person and they're short. And a person is good until the political flavor of the country changes, in which case they're bad. Or I belch after dinner here and I'm bad, but if I do it in Japan, I'm applauding the cook. Or anything that we consider good, there we can find somebody who thinks it's bad, and anything we think is bad, we can find somebody who thinks it's good. And every attribute we ascribe to anything we'll find is relative, and we may find ourselves ascribing the opposite attribute to it momentarily or years later or whenever. But the whole idea of any of these dualities is a mind-imposed thing. It's a label that we're adding to what's there. And as long as we're adding these labels to things, we're not seeing what's there. What's there is, let's say, a person. But tall or short or handsome or ugly or this or that is all added stuff. And what's there is really a spiritual being appearing as a person, but even if you look at it as a person, you're not going to see what's there if you've got all these labels, because the minute I put the label handsome, then I've got judgments about that, about which things are handsome and which things aren't, and why, and my head starts running and I don't see what's there. But especially think about the question about powers, that we really believe that there are an infinite number of things besides God that have power in our lives. And that apparently God is not even waging a standing position against them, because things are getting more and more hectic, it would seem. So the belief in two powers, in fact all the dualistic belief, is one of the things. And the second one, which is closely akin to that, it is, in fact, it came into it when I was talking there, is judgment. All the judgments that we make about things. I enjoy teasing some of the people who work with me closely, pointing out that, the source of all of our misery, the single most painful thing that a human being can know is how things ought to be. Absolute guaranteed source of pain. If you know how things ought to be, you have a yardstick and you can spend the rest of your life measuring how far it is from the yardstick, and no matter how we think things ought to be, they're not going to be that way all the time, because we are not going, we're not manipulating our environment as much as we think we can. So having any idea about how things ought to be is one of the primary sources of pain, and ought to be is a judgment. It's all of our judgments that are bringing pain to us. And it's also all of our judgments which are clouding our perception and not allowing us to see what's there. If I have a judgment about you, I will be seeing my judgment, I won't be seeing you. And if I have a judgment about a teaching, I will not be hearing the teaching. I will be looking for things to support my judgment. And if I have a judgment about things I know, then I will not be able to hear something new, because I will be so busy finding things wrong with it. So the human idea of judging is a primary one that needs to go, and that also is a real source of the success of Madison Avenue. They teach you how to judge, and which things to judge good and which things to judge bad, and then they warn you that if you don't do the good ones, your script's going to get read, and build up all sorts of fears in you. The third absolutely rock-solid conditioning of human consciousness is the idea of self-preservation. And that one is holding us here, that the idea of self-preservation, that need to, take care of ourselves at all expenses, at anybody else's expense. This is a deeply conditioned human belief, and it's absolutely keeping us locked into this material human concept of ourselves. It's preventing us from seeing the spiritual concept of ourselves. Just to give a glimpse of this, if you really knew that you were a spiritual being, then this striving to preserve this human concept, there is no human. If you really believe you're a human being, then this humanness is just a concept. Then there's no need to preserve this humanness, this human concept. Instead of killing other people to preserve my human self, it seems like I would be encouraging people to bump me off so that I could get rid of this, so that I could be back into my spiritual self, which is my real free being. Do you see? So if my clinging to my humanhood and my taking care of my humanhood and my making sure I get mine and get it first, and all the other beliefs that come with human consciousness about this, like there's not enough and I need to get mine and all this stuff, all of those ideas are locking me into my human material. This is me, this little finite, tiny little body, essentially practically impotent, especially in the face of 6.3 or 4 billion of them. This taking care of myself idea, this self-preservation is the major idea that locks me into that. Some time, good. So that's gives you a picture of the kind of things that need to be emptied out before we can attain full-on mystical consciousness. And obviously that's a very tall order. The good news is that as bits of it, as we give up bits of it, then we hear more. And as we hear more, more channels open up. And so it's a progressive thing, and we don't need to get rid of all. We don't need to empty the teacup fully before we can put any tea in the teacup. If we let a little bit of tea out, then we can put a little bit of tea in, okay? So, because it's a lifetime work to empty the teacup that I just described. Now, I thought I would leave you with this. I was at a yoga practice the other night, and the guy who teaches this yoga practice is also a real student of yoga, and he puts us in these positions, these poses, and it's called slow, deep stretch. So he leaves us there a while and feels like he needs to do something while we're in this bend for 5 minutes or 8 minutes or 10 minutes, and so he reads to us from various things. And he was reading the other night from Patanjali, who is the originator of the Yoga Sutras and one of the very early founders of all of yoga. And Patanjali listed the 5 causes of human suffering. And I thought, well, that's a good thing to know, because these are the 5 things we want to ditch because we're trying to get rid of human suffering and go for the spiritual recognition. And the first cause of human suffering is ignorance. And that's understandable. We got that being ignorant of our scripts, and our resistance behaviors has kept us in 90% of our human suffering, for example. So being ignorant of the truth is what he's really saying. And Jesus, on the other hand, said, know the truth and the truth will set you free. And he means free of suffering. So ignorance is one. The second one is egotism, the idea of self-preservation, the idea that there is a me and that I am this and need to do this and such like. The third one is attraction, being attracted to anything. desire. The idea that you want to do something is a human and a material thing, and it's keeping you away from your spiritual consciousness. And the fourth one is aversion. Just exactly the opposite side of that coin. The things that you're not attracted to, the things that we're not attracted to, we try to avoid, and that's aversion. So aversion is the fourth one. And the fifth one he threw in, which startled me, but I guess it works, is the fear of death. We try to avoid all sorts of pain and sickness and everything because we're afraid of dying. So I got to think about that a little bit during my 10 minutes of having my head in a vice or whatever it was we were doing at the time. And so then I thought, well, what does Robert Adams, for those of you who don't know, was my own personal guru for many years. What does Robert say the cause of suffering is? And Robert is a lot more succinct than Paññāli. Robert says the cause of all suffering is thinking you have a body. And by that he means thinking that you're a human being. He's saying, go straight to the top. If you quit thinking you're a human being, you will be the spiritual being that we're hopefully trying to reach for in doing work like this. So I thought, okay, that's cool. What does Joel think the causes of suffering? Let me see if I wrote that down back there. Let me look at that just to make sure I get his right. Oh, Joel's was the belief in good and evil. He says the entire cause of human suffering is the belief in good and evil, the belief in two powers. And it turns out, and hopefully by the end of this class, we'll see that that is the same as Robert's saying that believing you have a body. The belief in two powers is the belief that there's a power separate from God, the belief that there's a power that can cause any of the suffering. That is the cause of all evil, all suffering as far as Joel was concerned. And then I went to Barbara Mary Mull, who brought in the script and kid work for us. And she doesn't say the cause of all human suffering, but she does give us a very useful tool, which I thought I would mention. She says, make a list of everything you love, with human love, of everything you hate, of everything you desire, and everything you fear. And she said, these lists now are the lists of all the things that are tying you to your humanhood. And I notice the fear ties back to Paññāli, and the love and the desire is the attraction, and the fear is over, and the hate is the aversion. So, these guys are all very consistent at different levels and talking to different people. But it's this thing right here. It's afraid of this and wants this and doesn't want that, and thinks it knows this and thinks it exists. That's the source of the whole problem. Let's get quiet. Okay, that's plenty of stuff to empty out.